Our business before the governor arrives is to consider and act on the first annual Timothy J. O'Connor Award. The committee has met and developed a criteria, and the criteria is to award this honor to a member of the Brattleboro community who has exhibited outstanding achievement, advocacy, and service on behalf of the town of Brattleboro. And after due and considered deliberation and a thoughtful analysis of the many who have done so much for our community, the Brattleboro Committee has concluded that the awardee of this first annual award is Timothy J. O'Connor, Jr. Now, before I give this award on behalf of the committee, I want to say a few words about Timothy. And Timothy, if you've had a seat right there, I think you'd be most comfortable. Before doing so, I want to welcome our governor, Governor Howard Dean. We sit right next to Tim. And I want to introduce, before we visit about Timothy, our chair of the Brattleboro Committee, James A. Valenti. The biography of Timothy, everyone is familiar with. Grew up here on Spruce Street and learned what he had to learn at his mother's knee and a little bit more with the Sisters of St. Joseph at St. Michael's School, on to Holy Cross College in Georgetown. Came back to Brattleboro and became a town judge and a representative and a speaker and so much more. But rather than go through that criteria, I want to just take a minute and tell you about the person of Tim. And rather than those statistics, I want to tell you about a couple of people who really tell who Tim is. And I think sometimes through other people we best see ourselves, and maybe through other people we see those we love. I was out on the trail some time ago, and I went through a very hostile country in a place called Lamoille County. And I stopped on the side of the road, and this gentleman came out, and he said hello, and he said, "I want you to go back to Brattleboro and tell Tim O'Connor I was asking for him." And it was, of course, as you know, Stephen, Stub Earle. And he, like so many people across Vermont, exemplify what Tim O'Connor is. The good and the great, the common and the distinguished, the rich and the poor, the liberal and the Democrat. And in 1975, Tim got on his horse and went around this great state, and as a minority was elected the speaker. Probably the first time ever done, and we'd go down to Boston, he'd take me along to be a shotgun, and we'd go in to see Billy Bolger and Tommy McGee and the rest of these people who were speakers, and they say, "Here he comes, the miracle man, Tim O'Connor, who was elected by a minority." And that just exemplifies the kind of person that he is. The second person that tells a lot about Tim is a young man named Liam Smythe. Liam lived in the Springfield section of Belfast. Liam didn't know a Catholic, had never seen a Catholic, had never played any sports against a Catholic. And Tim went over there and set up an organization called Vermont and Irish Kids and brought 13-year-old kids to Brattleboro, 10 Catholics and 10 Protestants, and had them learn about each other and had them do what Tim does best, play ball. And through that effort, over the years, now we have great progress in the northern part of Ireland. And in the end, we will have peace there through the efforts of people like Tim. The third person, call her the Widow Riley. She's all over the place. She needs help with her health care. She needs help with her housing. She needs help because her husband has died. She needs help because her kids are in trouble. She needs help because she can't pay the bills, and she's very proud. And she goes to Tim O'Connor, and he takes care of her in every court in our state. And if it's a real estate problem, it's a probate problem, he takes care of her. I saw a lawyer the other day who claimed to be very successful, and he said, you know, I'm no longer a street lawyer. And I said to myself, oh, that you could meet Tim O'Connor, a real street lawyer who you'd be lucky to be like. There's people like these people, Tim, that say who you are. And through it all, there's a readiness. Tim, as relaxed as he is, he's always in the ready position. So if there's a problem, a challenge, Tim's the guy. When you think of Tim, you think of Havlicek stole the ball. If the tie score against the Lakers, what does he do? Steals the ball, he throws it in. And there was a problem or a challenge in our town, no more 4th of July parade. I don't think so. One guy said, Tim O'Connor. And he stole the ball, he developed a committee, and we are going to have a continuing 4th of July in Brattleboro. Tim comes from a great family, 3 wonderful children, and a charming and devoted and caring and loving wife who's been with him through every step of the way. We are very proud of Tim, of who you are and what you have done. And to try to say it best, it seems to me, that you have been engaged for all of your years with a love affair of our town. And when I think of that, I think of the words of the poet when he says, let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediment. Love is not love which alters when an alteration finds. Good and bad, Tim, up and down, you're always there. Or bends with a remover to remove. It is an ever fixed mark, and that's you, Tim, who looks on challenges and has never stayed. It is the star to every wandering bark. And how many wandering barks went by 63 Western Avenue and found their true course, whose worths unknown, although his heights be taken. Love alters not, with his love loves not time's fool, but rosy lips and cheeks is she out there within this bending sickle's right there. Sickle's compass come, not time's fool. You've done it all, Tim, and we are so proud to be part of this friendship, of this relationship. And we want this award to continue to your children and your children's children, and are proud for you for being our first recipient.
Well, first of all, thank all you folks for coming here this evening. I came because I have not seen Governor Dean since the last time he was here in Brattleboro, which was in January 2002, after he gave up the seat at the governor's office, came to Brattleboro, and we had the first Dean for President rally down at the Stakeout. And we had a fine time, and I'd like to welcome you back, Governor. You've been an inspiration to many of us, and we're glad to have you back here. All you folks who are here, you are the reason that I'm getting this award. I've never been associated with anyone from Brattleboro who hasn't been responsive to answer any challenge that I could give to the citizens of this town. You've accepted what we needed to do and ought to have done, and anything that I get as a result of this award really belongs to you, number one. Number two, Tom alluded to the fact that my wife, Martha, has been at my side, and she has. She's been one who has kept me in the fight, so to speak, and made sure that whatever we did was in the best interest of the community. And my family and children have also been very supportive. I thank you very much for this. I appreciate this. It's something that I never expected, and I'm very humbled by it. And this will be placed at the house in a distinguished spot so that all of you, if you're passing by, stop in and say hello. Thanks very much.
Governor Dean is going to speak now about health care, and there are some cards over at the table. If you have questions, if you want to go there and fill them out, the governor will be able to speak from them. Governor Dean needs no introduction, and I am anxious to listen to you, Howard, with the others. But I want to just thank you for what you have done and giving us an opportunity to make a difference. Governor Dean served admirably as our governor and worked with Vermonters to develop an outlook, and has taken that outlook to our country. Very busy and doing very, very important work. We are very grateful for your coming.
Thank you. This is a great. Thank you. This is a lot of fun to be back in Brattleboro. It was actually 2003, Tim. And as usual in the style that we never waste a moment, I actually drove from the swearing in of Governor Douglas to Brattleboro, and that night we started, that night. The O'Connor family has been mentors of mine and the younger generation managers of mine for a long, long time. So it is a real pleasure and a delight. As a matter of fact, not only were they my mentors and managers, they were my innkeepers as I stayed at 13 Oak Street for many, many times as governor and campaigner and everything else. So, Tim, I know Martha's here. I guess Kate is not. I don't know if Carrie and Kevin are here, but if they are, we want to say thank you for all your help and hospitality. I'm going to talk a little bit, answer a few questions, and I hope we have a little chance for schmoozing afterwards because my plane was a little late and I didn't get here quite as fast as I'd hoped I would. But I did see a couple of Massachusetts troopers lurking as I came flying up the.
Staying with Tim tonight?
Yeah. No, I got to get back tonight. So let me just talk. There are actually some great questions here, and let me just talk about. And they're all about health care. So I'm actually going to say a few words about something that's not health care, and then I'm just going to answer the questions about health care, and then we'll take some additional ones from the audience, and hopefully I won't talk too long. You know, I have a reputation for saying pretty much what I think and not trying to gloss things over, so I'm not going to gloss things over. We've had a tough year in the Democratic Party, and some of that is our fault and some of that is not. We have a Republican minority who acts like a majority because we act like a minority sometimes. We aren't tough enough. You know, the Republicans in Washington are not like the Republicans in Vermont, believe it or not. There are more reasonable ones here than there are there. But they have really decided they're not going to do anything for the country until they get back in power. So they've decided to put their country ahead, their party ahead of their country for the last 2 years, and that's what they've done. And that's reason number one why not as many things have been done as ought to have been. The second reason is we're not tough enough. The truth is we want to do the right thing. But in order to do the right thing, as Lyndon Johnson said, you have to, in order to make an omelet, you got to break some eggs. And, you know, the younger generation, which elected Barack Obama, really would like us to pull together and be bipartisan, and so would the country. But it takes two to be bipartisan, and I think people would much rather have a really strong health care bill than they would worry about being bipartisan with a bunch of right-wing people who don't care as much about the country as they ought to. So let's talk about where we go from here. The Scott Brown election was incredibly interesting because it wasn't so good for the Democrats, but it was also very interesting, and I'll tell you why. As you know, Democracy for America, which came from my campaign, is still run by my brother out of Burlington, and they, with a number of other progressive organizations, poll about every 2 or 3 weeks. Because if there's 5 or 6 of them, they can each kick in $5,000 and do a pretty good national poll for that. And here's what they found when they polled in Massachusetts on election night. 18% of all the people who voted for Scott Brown for the United States Senate were Obama voters. That is, he would not have won without Obama voters. Secondly, of those people, 57% thought health care ought to have a public option, and 80% thought the bill didn't go far enough. Those are the ones that voted for Brown. Of the Obama Democrats that stayed home and didn't vote at all, 86% thought the bill didn't go far enough, and by 6-1 they thought they ought to have a public option in their bill. And the media has made much, especially the talking heads on cable, one of which I am from time to time, of this is a populist rebellion. Well, it's a populist rebellion, but it's not a populist rebellion just on the right. It's a populist rebellion on the right and the center and the left, but it's manifested differently. On the right center, people can't wait to get out and vote and do bad things to the Democrats. On the left, our base has been demoralized. And their view of this is to stay home or vote for people they think are moderate Republicans. We can't do that. When I used to be the chair of the DNC, as you know, I wasn't the most popular person in Washington, which meant I was doing a really good job because they're always the last to figure out what's going on in Washington. When I used to be chair of the DNC, I was very blunt. I said, look, our job is not just to elect a Democratic president, a Senate, and a Democratic House. Our job is to elect people we can start to talk to move this country forward, and then to hold their feet to the fire and make sure they move it forward. This is not the time to get demoralized. Anybody who thought that we were going to suddenly change America in one election cycle is wrong. It took a long time between the time that Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat and the Civil Rights Bill was signed. That did not happen in one election cycle. And this is about our willingness to stick to it every single day. If the folks we sent to Washington don't do all the things we ask, then we still ought to be active. We can be active in the community, and some of these things are going to have to be done at the state level. Real campaign finance. I mean, the Obama administration wasn't the ones that put those people on the court who decided corporations ought to be able to run our political system even more than they do already. So there is no going back, and we need to make sure that we get active in every single race. This is the most extraordinary year running for governor of I've ever seen in Vermont. 5 well-qualified candidates running on the Democratic side. That's the problem. There are 5, but they're well-qualified. Imagine the Democrats being strong enough to have 5 really good candidates, any of whom could do a good job as governor. We have a great opportunity here. So there is a lot to be done, and there are differences to be made, and we need to make those differences. Change does not come from the top. We created the conditions for change in the last election. It was an extraordinary election. I'm going to tell you about it in a minute. But we have to continue now to create the conditions so that those folks can change. And that means encouraging them, and it also means calling them out when we don't think they're doing it right. The Scott Brown election was a form of calling them out. But that is a self-destructive thing to do, because the truth is that Martha Coakley wouldn't have been the vote that killed health care reform, and Scott Brown will be. Well, actually, frankly, Joe Lieberman was the vote that killed health care reform. But we can't allow ourselves to be held hostages by the Joe Liebermans of the world. For every Joe Lieberman, there's 1 million Americans that depend deeply on us undoing whatever he does. We need to stand up for what we believe in, and we need to do it every single day. And this is a great state. Calvin Coolidge had a great quote. The quote, I don't remember it exactly, and I wish I had written it down. But it's an extraordinary quote about something along the lines of, if courage should fail the entire nation, there'll be enough stored in the extraordinary people of the state of Vermont to replace all of it. This is an extraordinary state, and we ought not to get ourselves demoralized. There is much to be done. So let me just talk for a second about the electoral nature of what happened in 2008, because it truly was a revolution. This is the first election in my lifetime, and Tim's as well, I think, and anybody's in this room, where more people under the age of 35 voted than who were over the age of 65. This is the John Kennedy of our generation. Now, John Kennedy was my father's age, but he was my first president at 12 years old, because he represented a whole new generation and a new way of doing things coming out of the 50s and the McCarthy era and so forth and so on. Barack Obama represents a new generation. It's part of why this has been so difficult in the last year or so. This under 35 generation is an extraordinary group. There really is a generational divide here. And like most great leaders, Obama's genius is not that he said, here's where we're going to go. What he did was understand and absorb the energy of this new generation and reflect it back, kind of like a parabolic mirror in articulate form. So I'll tell you some numbers which will make the case of what happened in this extraordinary generation. In 2004, young people under 35 increased their turnout by 20% over 2000. And they voted 56% for John Kerry. It was actually the only age group that he carried. In 2006, young people under 35 increased their turnout by 24% over the previous off-year election, and across the country voted 61% for the Democratic congressional candidate. And in 2008, they outvoted, in terms of numbers, people who are over 65. This is a new generation that has come to power. Now, they aren't in the halls of power yet, but they are responsible more than anybody else for who gets there and who doesn't. But that's not all. This generation is different than our generation. They are truly the boom echo, but their values are different than ours. When I got off the campaign trail after I ran for president, I came home and was trying to put our lives back together again as a family. And my kids, who were both teenagers at the time, said one time, we were sitting talking about this, and she said, Dad, you're just too confrontational. Well, there's a certain insult to having your teenage children tell you that your parents are too confrontational. But they were right. They were right. Our generation has been a confrontational generation. Vietnam, women's rights, civil rights, gay rights, human rights in general. We fought to change this country, and it was a struggle, literally a struggle, sometimes fighting. The convention in Chicago in '68. But I think that was necessary. I'm not ashamed of the confrontation. When my wife, who graduated from high school in 1971 from a suburban high school in New York, around New York City, was a junior in high school, there were two girls and a boys playing field for sports programs. And they needed to do a construction project at the high school. So in order to accommodate the extra equipment and so forth, they just simply got rid of girls' sports for a year, and that was the end of girls, and that was that. Today, you couldn't even think about that. That's outside the thought process of most young women who are in high school today. Why? Because we fought for Title IX, we went to court, and we struggled, so there really would be equality of opportunity. So it has been, it's a different country, but this country, these young people want to work with each other. Their central question to our generation is, can you stop fighting about the things you've been fighting about for 30 years and let us work together and find some solutions to things that we agree on? We did an enormous amount of polling when I was running the DNC among evangelical Christians. In fact, you'll get a kick out of this. I guess I can tell this story now since the 3 or 4 year statute of limitations is almost expired. We used to have secret meetings with evangelicals that would come to us. I'd have to go to the hotel 5 minutes before or 5 minutes after. We didn't leave together and all this kind of stuff. We didn't meet with the real right-wingers, but we met with some pretty conservative people. And they partly, of course, wanted Bush to find out about it because they were mad at him and wanted to think they would lose. But there were some things that we could deliver that they understood they needed to talk about. People under 35. If you poll evangelicals over 35, you know what the two big issues that they are worried about. They're worried about gay rights and they're worried about abortion rights. But if you poll 35 years and down among evangelical Christians, here are the top 3 issues that they care about. Number 1 is poverty, number 2 is climate change, and number 3 is Darfur. Now, when I got to the DNC, I canned all the consultants because they've been teaching us how to lose and taking a lot of money for it for 20 years. And I hired a bunch of 35-year-olds and under. And our pollster was a 35-year-old African-American by the name of Cornell Belcher, who came to show me that something the Republicans had known for years, and I suspected, is that the Democrats are values voters too. It's just that we have a different set of values in terms of what we believe. But Democrats and faith voters under 35 vote on similar things. I looked at this poll that Cornell did and I said, this could come right out of the Democratic Party platform. Why aren't we talking to these people? There is a sea change among this younger generation. It's not just among liberals and progressives and so forth. It's every kid. because they go to church, these evangelicals. They don't want to hear hellfire and damnation and divisive hate speech. What they want to hear is how they can be a better person and how they can make their world a better person. And that doesn't include beating up on other people who don't agree with them. So this isn't just a change among the generation of Democrats that went out and voted for Barack Obama. In fact, this is the tough part for us. These kids aren't Democrats. They voted 63% for Barack Obama. They're not Democrats. They have turned away from the Republican Party because they don't like that. They grew up with all the people that the Republican Party is pointing their fingers at. They have friends who are gay. They have friends who are of different races and religions and ethnicities. And they all grew up together. And they live in the world that we hoped to build in the 1960s. They live in that world. We never lived in it. But we did everything we could to make it build. We did build it. We just built it for the next generation. And that's what they live in. And they aren't ever going to embrace the Republican Party as long as they're beating up on gays and immigrants and minorities and all this other stuff. But they are fiscally conservative because look at what they're going through right now. And so if the Republicans somehow have to cast off the 35% of their people who are hate voters and have to embrace fiscal conservatives, and they're starting to do it because these are not stupid people, these Republicans. It's going to be a really interesting election because they probably can't do it fast enough. But we need to get our act together. Bill Clinton, who I still consider to be the greatest mind in American politics, once said people will always vote for someone who is strong and wrong before they'll vote for somebody who's right and weak. We have been right and weak. We need to get much tougher. If George W. Bush had been president of the United States and by some miracle had wanted to do health care reform, it would have been on his desk in August and signed because he would have used reconciliation as he did 5 times in order to get 51 votes instead of 59. We need to be tougher. If we believe in what we're doing, we ought to do what we said we would do, and then we will win elections again. But if we promise one thing and we don't deliver on it, we're not going to win re-elections, and that's not going to be very good for the country or for our children. Now, let's talk a little bit about health care. I think the president's plan that he talked about during the campaign was brilliant because I know there are constituencies, and in this room there's a fairly high percentage of people who want a single payer. There's nothing wrong with a single payer. A single payer, in fact, is the most efficient and effective way to deliver health care. Not only that, we actually have a single payer in this country. We have a single payer in this country that has 50 million people, and it's called Medicare, and it works pretty well. In fact, all those people who are bad-mouthing Medicare, the Republicans actually are going to run on a platform that says people under 55 can't get into Medicare, and it'll phase it out. I'm looking forward to that discussion in the fall. But Medicare, you can take it in any state you want. Everybody pays the same whether they're sick or not. You can't get excluded for pre-existing conditions. You can't be thrown out if you get sick. And if you lose your job, you don't lose your health insurance. Sounds to me like a pretty good policy. In fact, sounds to me like anything better than the private sector offers. And you know what else we have in this country? This is astonishing. We have socialized medicine in this country. Socialized medicine. The Republicans used to complain about socialized medicine. Lordy, we have socialized medicine right here in America. You know how many people are in the socialized system? 25 million. It's called the Veterans Administration. It's all the people who defended America that the Republicans keep talking about all those years, although not too many of them actually defended America. Well, and you know something else about this socialized system that we have in the Veterans Administration? It is, by its own patients, the #1 ranked healthcare system in the country, including Kaiser and all these other things. #1, Mayo Clinic, Veterans Administration is ranked among the people who get care from them as the best medical system in the country. So not only do we have a single payer in this country, not only do we have a socialized system in this country, but the socialized system is ranked higher than any other. Now, why did I like Barack Obama's health care plan? Because it's realistic. 65% of the American people like the health care they get. They complain it's too expensive, but they like it. They like the employer-based system. I happen to think the employer-based system is probably not too good for our business community, but at least let's leave that aside. The art of politics is not just telling people who like something they can't have it anymore. Americans hate that. It is working with folks to change the system. Now, I never suspected for a moment that the Congress of the United States was going to pass health care reform. What I had hoped is that they would give us enough choices so that we could make the reforms ourselves by choosing the system that we wanted. And what we needed, and the fight over the public option was not some fetish, as the Inside the Beltway columnists, smug columnists said. The fight over the public option was, do we get to choose? Who makes the choice? Shall we continue with a system where our employers, our insurance companies, and our government tell us what we have to do? Or will we get the choice of these other systems, one of which is ranked the highest, the best system in terms of quality of care in the United States of America? Would we get a choice? In the end, the answer was no. Now, this is a Democratic gathering, I want to point out a little flaw in Democrats in general. We all tend to do it. We tend to always see the glass as 1/4 full when it's really 3/4 full. And I have heard more stuff if I've been around the country about, oh, the Democrats this and the Democrats that. We have 4 jerks in the Democratic caucus out of 60 that screwed up health care. They have 40 that come to work every day in the Republican caucus. Give me a break. You can't blame this in the Democratic Party. You can blame this on the 4 people who made deals and cut deals and were in the insurance company's power. 56 of them were willing to vote for a public option. You can't blame the Democratic Senate. Pat Leahy is out there today, one of 8 senators who signed a letter asking the president and Harry Reid to use reconciliations at this time to get a public option through. So we can't beat up on ourselves so much. Let's look at, it was 4 Democrats that did this and 40 Republicans that did this in the Senate. Not, quote, the Democratic Party. But we still need to be tougher. They want to do the right thing. What we need is toughness to do the right thing. So I think the president's bill was a good one. It wasn't perfect, but it was a good one. It allowed people to start making choices. I will say one other thing politically about all this. I think we should have used a Medicare expansion as a public option. Not for 2 reasons. First of all, why start your own insurance company in HHS when you already have one that processes 1 billion claims a year in the government? But there's a political consideration for this. And this is where we failed. There were 2 huge mistakes that we made during this. One, we didn't think down the road far enough to realize that we were going to need reconciliation. If you need all 60 votes in your caucus, then somebody's going to hold up the works and say, well, I'll give you the 60th if blah, 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 and then the bill falls apart. The other was, who could possibly conceive a bill from a political point of view that you pass in 2009 and doesn't go into effect till 2013? So all these things, the death panels and all this stuff that the Republicans talk about, none of which is true, but they say it exists. We say it doesn't. So we got to defend this thing for 4 years. That's 2 election cycles, not to mention the special election. The Democrats are on playing defense on health care reform. If you were to have used Medicare and Medicaid to expand, as we did, remember, 99% of the kids in this state either have private insurance or are eligible for Medicaid because of the Dr. Dinosaur program. We have universal health care for kids under 18 in this state. We did that 16 years ago, and it still works just fine. It'll work for the rest of the country. But we should have used Medicare and Medicaid for the basis of the expansion and the choices that our folks would get, because it would mean that 2 months after the president signed the bill, people would start getting insurance. I tell people all the time about the civil unions bill here. And when we signed that in 2000, all the uproar that there was and how hard it was to run for re-election, how angry people were. You all remember the joy of it, but I'll tell you, walking around Franklin County during the Dairy Days parades was not so much fun, especially since the beer usually starts flowing around 10 o'clock in that particular parade, as Tim will remember from his days campaigning in Franklin County for governor. But the point I'm trying to make is, I remember being told that the teachers union would teach our children how to be gay in kindergarten. I remember, I'm not joking, you remember, well, maybe you don't remember this in Brattleboro, because this is sort of the center of progressivism here. But I can remember being told this was going to be the AIDS capital of the world. And lo and behold, after we signed the bill, we went through the election, we lost 20 seats in the House, and I barely won. I had a progressive opponent. I got 50.1%. If I'd gotten 200 less votes, the legislature, which was a Republican legislature after they got done, would have elected Ruth Dwyer governor. Boy, that was close. But the point I'm trying to make here is, after the election, civil unions, the due date came and the civil unions began. 2 years later, in the next gubernatorial election, this wasn't an issue. Nobody ran promising to repeal it. Why? because it went into effect. And lo and behold, our kindergarten children didn't come home and announce that they were gay because the teachers' union told them they had to be. And we weren't the AIDS capital of the world. In fact, our neighbors who were gay or lesbian were better off, and we weren't any worse off. And that was the end of the debate. And all of a sudden, marriage passes on a gubernatorial override. It's incredible. 8 years later, 9 years later. Now, what does this have to do with health care? The best cure for people who say a lot of things that aren't so and inflame the public and make them afraid is to do it. If you're sure it's the right thing to do, do it. Because once you do it, all of a sudden, I can just see right now, somebody's neighbor in some conservative state who's 56 years old and haven't had any health insurance for 3 years because they got laid off and nobody will hire somebody who's 50 and can't get health insurance. Well, you know, I must admit, I've had health insurance for 6 or 8 months. I haven't been called before the death penalty panel yet, and I still see my own doctor. That deflates all the stuff about health care. But instead, we now have to defend this bill against all this nonsense for 4 years. We didn't think this thing through, and we needed to do that. However, so what's going to happen from here? I don't know what's going to happen from here. I don't think anybody else does either. I still think there's going to be some sort of an attempt to pass something. And my view of this is it probably is going to end up being incremental anyway. So it's important to me that the increments be in the right direction, not the wrong direction. And Tim will attest to this as a veteran of the Vermont legislature, because all legislatures, including Congress, are like this. When you have a really big bill going through, although Congress is more like this than any place I know, but when you have a really big bill going through, at the end, and it's really close, at the end there's this incredible scramble for votes. And when you need 1 or 2 more votes, you're apt to put stuff in those bills to get those 1 or 2 more votes. And the scramble was really huge in Washington. And so more and more stuff got added. And at the end of the bill process in the Senate, what we had was a long-term commitment to use the private sector only to have universal health care in America. But that wasn't the intention of the Democrats. It happened because in the scramble for those last 2 or 3 votes, you basically make public policy for the long term only thinking about what you're going to need in the next 15 days to get your bill passed. It's a terrible way to legislate, and it's particularly bad in Congress. And that's what happened. Now, look, there are 2 countries that deliver universal health care, the Dutch and the Swiss, entirely in the private sector. It can work. The problem is if they do it, they can only do it by regulating the insurance industry, the health insurance industry, as if it's a public utility. Now, our insurance industry in this country is not about to be regulated like a public utility. Obviously, it's the most powerful lobby group in the Capitol. It just fought a president who got elected with a huge majority, and the Democratic Congress, which was overwhelmingly Democratic, to an absolute standstill. So what this bill has set us up to do is have a fight for 30 years with the insurance industry over every single regulation, and it's going to cost us billions of dollars that we don't need to spend, in my view. I think we should have just I don't think we necessarily had to have a single payer to have this be a success, but I do think that we needed to give the American people a choice of being in a single payer if they wanted to. Put this in the marketplace. Stack up an insurance program that has real community rating and guaranteed issue. By the way, all this stuff about pre-existing conditions is half hooey in this bill. You're not allowed to discriminate based on pre-existing conditions, but you are allowed to charge older people 3 times as much as younger people in insurance. Explain to me how that's guaranteed issue. It's guaranteed issue as long as you can pay $20,000 a year for a health insurance. You know, this thing got hijacked by, as I said, a few right-wing senators in the Democratic Party and 40 people in the Republican Party who were determined to kill no matter what. I tell you what, if we'd put gun control and tax breaks for malpractice control and tax breaks for the rich in this bill, we still wouldn't have gotten a single Republican vote. They were just going to vote no matter what we did. So I think there'll be some attempt to pass some things. I hope what we pass will be good things. If it's some modest insurance reform, I think that's great. Selling insurance, by the way, across state lines, that would undo our pretty much universal health care program for kids here, and it would undo the really good controls on insurance companies we have here. We have, in our state, you have to sell people insurance, and the insurance companies can't charge 20% more for anybody than their best rate. It's a 20% rate ban as opposed to the 300% rate ban in the Senate bill. That makes a big difference. And if we had to compete with policies from Texas, that would essentially make the health insurance commissioner in Texas the commissioner in Vermont. That's not a good idea. So there is possible to do damage by passing a bill, even if it's incremental. If they're willing to do some modest insurance regulation, if they're willing to, both bills had a significant Medicaid expansion, which would have helped a lot, especially with younger people and single people who are, just barely above the poverty line. That kind of stuff would help a lot. There are some things they can do, and I think the Obama administration still wants to do something, and I think we should do something. But then we're not going to wait for 15 years for the next time. That's the big talk in Washington. Oh my God, if we don't pass something, we'll wait for 15 years. No, we waited for 15 years the last time. We can't do that again. We're at 17.3% of what we pay of our total GNP on health care. That is a fiscal emergency, and we can't afford that. So I am cautiously optimistic that something will pass. I am worried that what passes might not be so great, and I guess we're going to find out. So I'm going to read some of these cards off and answer questions, and then I'm going to, if people want to raise their hand where their question hasn't been asked or answered, I'm happy to do that. But let me thank you again. Kate asked me to do this, and I was thrilled to do something for Kate, but even more thrilled to do something for her father, who has been an extraordinary, effective contributor. Tim O'Connor, as Tom said, really is the quintessential Vermont great citizen. He's given a great deal to his state in a leadership role, and when he didn't become governor, he didn't hang it up and get out of politics. He did a great deal of state, both for his state and for his community, and that's what you have to do to be a great Vermonter, and that's what you have to do to be a great American. Tim, thank you very much. Okay, well, some of these I've answered. What are the implications of Scott Brown's win to Democratic campaigns in Vermont? I don't think they're much. I think, I think it'll be a close election, a tough election. They have one candidate. They've already decided on, the Republicans, and we have 5. We're going to have a primary, and our primary is late. So, we clearly have some sorting out to do. On the other hand, I believe that the people of Vermont are going to pick a Democrat to be the next governor. I think they are really wanting, since the federal government hasn't done the things that they need to do in terms of health care and so forth, that they're really wanting some change, and I think they'll get it. By the way, let me just say, we focused on health care and the failings of the Washington folks. The Obama administration has done some fantastic things that they aren't getting any credit for. What they have done environmentally is incredible. Carol Brown, and they've done it through, I read, the first time I've ever read through cover to cover, a 50-page executive order. The president put out a 50-page executive order this summer, which basically forces the American government, absent the Defense Department, to comply with Kyoto. That's unbelievable. That's by far the largest employer in America is the federal government. I've forgotten how much of the GNP is that, but that means a fairly substantial portion of our gross national product is now going to be generated by people who comply with Kyoto. That in itself is an enormous achievement. I think Copenhagen was a success, not a failure. The Europeans were disappointed because they're the leaders in the environmental movement in the world, and they were hoping for more, but the truth is we got the Indians and the Chinese and the Brazilians to the table this time, and we didn't do that in Kyoto, and getting people talking and moving in a direction, I think, is a step forward. So I do think there's a lot of successes. We've been focusing on healthcare, which is not a success, but there's an enormous amount of successes, and I can tell you from my travels that he has restored the good name of America around the world. And I really do believe after the Iraqi elections, our troops are going to start coming home and very quickly. And if they don't, I'm sure the president will hear about it from us. All right. What is my opinion regarding the current Democratic majority in Washington seemingly acting like the minority? Well, I think we sort of talked about that too, so I don't need to do that. What did you see as my role of getting a health care bill passed? Well, I hope I didn't have one since it failed. I think that they've learned a hard lesson, which is that when people are going to oppose you no matter what happens, that you have to be much tougher than you might be if you really hoped. They sent some pretty clear signals right from the beginning that the Republicans weren't going to work with us no matter what we did, and I think we didn't take that into account. Am I going to run it again in 2016? You never say never, but once you've done this, you're crazy if you do it the second time. But I appreciate the sentiment. How can we eliminate poverty in the USA today? I'll tell you one thing. Health care for all sure would be a big start. I mean, there are more bankruptcies because of health care than that's the largest factor in bankruptcy of any factor, including home foreclosure, in the United States. So, and what we did for seniors, seniors used to be the poorest group in America by far. And then with Social Security and Medicare, that's not true anymore. Unfortunately, the big disgrace now is that kids are the poorest group in America. And in this state, that's less true because we do have universal health care for kids under 18, which I was reminded of all over the country. I'd run into people who say, my mom was a single mom, and because of Dr. Dinosaur, I grew up with health insurance. I never would have had it. She didn't have any, but we all had it. It's a really big deal, and we should be very proud of that. We should maintain that, and I think there's a huge public support for that in Vermont. But that would be the first thing in terms of eliminating poverty, which would be to make sure that that the safety net was much stronger than it is today. And the other thing is, we really do have to do something about reforming Wall Street. I'm not one of those people who attacks capitalism at every turn. In fact, one of my favorite stories I love to tell about when I was governor is Peter Shumlin once took me to Putney. I was doing town meetings in Windham County, and he insisted that I go to his town, sort of off the schedule. So I go there, and I actually got booed in Putney because I refused to talk about raising the income tax. They demanded I raise the income tax in Putney. So as you may remember, I was a reasonably pro-business governor. So what I'm about to say may shock some people, and I'm also 4 generations of Wall Street families. Wall Street has been turned into a giant gambling casino by these banks and these big insurance companies. And I could quote you chapter and verse, but people who say that I used to think were exaggerating, and maybe they were. But today, there are things like credit default swaps, which don't contribute to any jobs at all, except on Wall Street. I do some work for the biotech industry, which is this incredible cutting-edge industry. Most of the companies don't make any money, and they have these incredible products, which someday I hope will get to market. They can't get enough venture capital. Why? Because it's easier to make scads of money pushing people's papers around and making bets. And Goldman, a company which is very well run, actually sold a bunch of default collateral debt obligations and then bet against them and shorted them after they'd sold them to their own customers. I mean, this stuff is legal. It shouldn't be, but it is. So that would be a big thing. If we could have a Wall Street that really does work the way it's supposed to, which is to allocate capital and help the economy and help businesses get capital so they can grow, that's what the original function of Wall Street was intended to be. And if we could go back to that, that would help a lot in terms of eliminating poverty. Given the lack of progress in health care, do you think there's a better chance of reform if the states lead the way? Not only do I think there's a better chance of reform if the states lead the way on health care, and I just want to say a couple of words about Massachusetts. A lot of people are very negative about the Massachusetts reform. I'm not so negative. I think, obviously, if they'd had a public option, it would have worked better, and it's expensive. But I do think it's a big step down the road, and they're going to learn an enormous amount from their mistakes. They do have 97% or 96% insured. That's extraordinary. No state, including this one, has that in terms of its adult population. But the thing that's so interesting is because of their costs are not under control at all, they are now going to have to take some steps that the Congress wasn't willing to take, and nobody's been taking, including us. They're actually talking now about eliminating fee-for-service medicine. That is a very good thing, especially for people like me. Specialists don't like it, of course. But internists and primary care physicians in this country make less money than they do in the National Health Service in Great Britain, where they spend half as much. You are better off on salary working for the National Health Insurance in one of the most socialized countries in the world in terms of its medicine than you are as in a free enterprise system practicing primary care here in the United States of America. I think a lot of doctors who are primary care people would love to be on salaries and be able to spend 15 minutes instead of 6 with a patient again and not have all these crazy incentives that make us do more and more and more stuff. So if that happens in Massachusetts, it's going to happen all over the country. That would be a huge step forward to removing the crazy system of perverse incentives in the medical system that helps to drive costs up. So I do think there will be a lot more reform in the states if this significant health care reform doesn't pass. I also think, because this question is partly about the influence of corporations in the process, I think we can have real campaign finance reform. And the way to do it is to go on, you can't do that in a state like Vermont, although we actually had a pretty good law until the right-wing judicial activists got held of it on the Supreme Court. But in this state, the two most far-reaching campaign finance laws are in Maine and Arizona, and they were put on by citizens on the ballot over the objections of their legislature. Although that's not true. In Maine, they passed it, and then it was upheld on the ballot. But in Arizona, the legislature didn't want to do it, and the public put it on. So I think we ought to be able to do campaign finance reform, carefully crafted, of course, to avoid the clutches of Antonin Scalia. And we ought to do that state by state, and that's a great cause for progressive activists. We don't have to, all our focus doesn't have to be on federal raises. My reaction to the news that Blue Cross of California increased their rates by 40%, not a surprise at all. This is going on all over the country. That was just the most egregious one. Look, here's the problem with insurance companies. I don't have a big thing about how they're all evil people and all this stuff. But the problem is that they have two responsibilities. One is to their customers, and the other is to their bottom line and their shareholders. And they've made their choice, and their clients and their customers weren't the choice. So Aetna has admitted that they're going to kick 600,000 people off their insurance rolls this year in order to increase their profits substantially. In the 3 years between 2005 and 2008, there was testimony in Congress last summer that the three biggest insurance companies in the country kicked 20,000 people off their rolls, which resulted in a $300 million increase to their bottom line, because those are the 20,000 sickest people with insurance in America. That is the health insurance industry in this country. And I don't think that they're above anything in order to make money, and I'm not a fan of the private health insurance industry in this country. If it were up to me, I would like that choice so that I could choose the public option. I'm from Massachusetts. Our healthcare system is still very expensive. It's outrageously expensive. It's $1,000 a month for deductibles, 25% of gross income of the questioner. It was Mitt Romney, but Ted Kennedy supported it. Well, that kind of gets to it's a good place to stop. That gets to where we are in the debate. Ted Kennedy used to have a wonderful saying, which I've used from time to time, is we don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good. That is, we always have to work towards something, and we have to make our judgment if the something we're getting is better than what we have today. And when you do that, you can't think about just what it's going to be like tomorrow. You've got to think of what it's like 15 years down the line. If the Senate bill tomorrow passed, I think more people would be insured. And there are those in Washington who are from the Democratic wing of the Democratic Party who think we ought to pass a Senate bill because more people will get insurance. I'm not so crazy about it because I think it will lead us in a direction that we'll pay a big price for 15 or 20 years from now. But as I said before about Massachusetts, there are real problems in Massachusetts. The fact that they got to 97 or 96 or 7% of insurance is a huge step forward. But there are significant, and this is one of them, nobody should be paying 25% of their income for health insurance. It's not sustainable for anybody. Those are the kind of people that end up in bankruptcy if they have a serious illness. And so at the end of the day, but I'm still in favor, I'm still glad Massachusetts did what they did, because they're now going to learn how to fix this problem. And at the end of the day, this is sort of the human condition. We make reforms. They're not perfect. We've got to go back and reform the reforms, and we have to make the judgment about how to do that. So let me thank you. Let me thank you very much for coming. Let me thank you for helping the Democratic Party, and let me thank you for saluting one of the people who I admire most in Vermont, and that's Tim O'Connor.